Honourable Member for Edmonton St. Albert.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and it's certainly a pleasure for me to rise in support of Bill C-42 and against the sub-amendment that has just been put on the floor of this House. Madam Speaker, Bill C-42 would amend the Aeronautics Act to ensure that Canadian air carriers can comply with the United States flight program and maintain Canadians' access to southern destinations via continental U.S. airspace. Madam Speaker, this legislation before us today would also strengthen the North American air transportation system against terrorist attacks and enhance the protection of all air travelers. I know that all honourable members understand the importance of achieving both of these goals. Achieving these goals, Madam Speaker, will be easier if we are all clear on what Bill C-42 will and will not do. Madam Speaker, some comments I've heard during the debates and that we've seen in newspaper editorials would suggest that if Bill C-42 is passed, then all domestic flights will have to comply with the Secure Flight Program. That, Madam Speaker, is absolutely false. The truth of the matter is that our government worked very hard with the U.S. administration to gain an exemption to the Secure Flight rules for domestic flights between Canadian cities which overfly U.S. airspace. This is an important distinction and an important exemption, Madam Speaker, since many flights between Canadian cities do in fact travel through U.S. airspace. Such flights under the provisions of Bill C-42 and the Secure Flight Rule will not, and I repeat, will not be subject to the Secure Flight requirements. Neither U.S. law nor Bill C-42 will require that information related to passengers on those flights will be shared with the U.S. government. Madam Speaker, I have not only heard it said that the Secure Flight will apply to all Canadian domestic flights, which I have just previously mentioned is completely and absolutely wrong. I have also heard testimony at the committee hearings implying that Bill C-42 might require that passenger information be sent to countries such as Russia or China for flights between Vancouver and Hong Kong, for example, or to Latin American countries for flights to Colombia or Brazil originating in Canada, and to European and Middle Eastern countries for flights from Canada to Dubai. Madam Speaker, I want to be clear, and I want all members in the House to be absolutely clear on this point. Bill C-42 amends Section 4.83 of the Aeronautics Act so that Canadian airline companies can provide only the United States government with passenger information for all flights which overfly continental U.S. airspace. Madam Speaker, I also want to highlight measures taken by the government to address concerns raised by opposition members and by the Privacy Commissioner, Ms. Jennifer Stoddard, when this bill was vetted at the Committee of Transport. There were some concerns related to what Canadians were being told in relation to secure flight and whether they would be made fully aware of what information would be shared and with whom. To address these concerns, we introduced a government amendment at the committee stage that will require an operator of an aircraft that is due to fly over but not land in the U.S. to notify all persons who are on board or expected to be on board that information relating to them may be provided to a competent authority in the United States. Madam Speaker, this measure will ensure that Canadians are aware that their information will be shared with the U.S. government for flights overflying U.S. airspace to a third country. This amendment addresses concerns raised by the opposition and other witnesses during committee testimony, and it is submitted, Madam Speaker, that it does significantly improve the bill. Madam Speaker, I would now like to shift gears a little and talk to the House about some of the testimony that was heard at committee from the airline companies themselves, as well as from the tourism industry generally. What was said at committee is relevant and very important, Madam Speaker, and that is that the economic costs of not passing Bill C-42 would be severe. The Canadian Tourism Industry Association noted, and I quote, "The use of alternate routes will mean longer travel times, higher costs, and increased environmental impact," unquote, for flights not in compliance with the final rule of U.S. security plans. They went on to add that travelers will likely choose other destinations than Canadian ones to spend their money when they would be required to make, where they would not be required to make stopovers or long flyovers. That would undoubtedly have a negative and severe impact on the Tourism Association's 8,000 direct and affiliate members across the country who in turn represents some 1.6 million Canadians whose jobs depend on the economic impact of tourism in Canada. Madam Speaker, the airline industry has been absolutely clear with the government that they support C-42 and that they require it to be passed to remain competitive in the North American aviation industry. The Tourism Association of Canada similarly is clear and unequivocal in their support of Bill C-42. Bill C-42, Madam Speaker, will ensure that Canadians can access travel destinations in a safe, quick and cost-effective manner while also protecting their privacy and individual rights. Amendments to the Aeronautics Act will enable Canadian air carriers to provide limited passenger information to U.S. Transportation Security Agency 72 hours prior to departure for destinations requiring entry into U.S. airspace, such as the Caribbean and Latin American destinations. Passenger data will be collected by the U.S. Transportation Security Administration for the purpose of passenger watch list matching. Canadian air carriers, Madam Speaker, are currently required to match passenger information against the U.S. so-called no-fly and selected tourist watch lists for flights destined to the U.S. Yet privacy concerns and false matches have been raised, and our government is acutely aware of the importance of protecting privacy and individual rights. By transferring responsibility for watch list matching from air carriers to the U.S. Transportation Security Agency, secure flight is expected to reduce false matches. Only information necessary to conduct watch list matching will be gathered. All personal data will be collected, used, distributed, stored, and disposed of in accordance with U.S. guidelines and applicable U.S. privacy laws and regulations. In fact, Madam Speaker, the vast majority of travel records collected by the Secured Flight Program will be destroyed shortly after the completion of the individual's travel. The Canadian government is focused on ensuring that the privacy of Canadians is protected and has expressed this concern to the U.S. In compliance with the U.S. Secure Flight Program, Canadian air carriers will transmit each passenger's full name, date of birth, and gender. If available, the passenger's redress number, passport information, and itinerary details will also be transmitted. Passenger data will only be compared against the U.S. no-fly and selectee list unless specific security considerations warrant further action. By amending the Aeronautics Act, Madam Speaker, the Government of Canada is taking the necessary steps to ensure that Canadian air carriers can comply with the U.S. Secure Flight Program, which requires U.S. and international air carriers to share passenger information with the U.S. government for flights that fly into and overfly continental U.S. en route to a third country. The Convention on International Civil Aviation, also known as the 1944 Chicago Convention, stipulates that all carriers are obliged to operate under the legislation of another country once they enter its airspace. There is no alternative, Madam Speaker, in meeting U.S. secure flight requirements. As I have mentioned, non-compliance by Canadian air carriers would result in lengthy and costly delays, as the U.S. has the legal right under international law to determine who enters its airspace and can legally deny overflight rights to Canadian air carriers destined for third country destinations. Should this occur, Canadians flying from example, from Winnipeg to Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, would have to travel around the continental U.S. rather than taking a direct route across U.S. airspace if this information is not shared and provided to U.S. authorities. This detour would result in additional expenses incurred by Canadian travelers in addition to unnecessary inconvenience and added travel time, and the effects on the Canadian tourist and airline industries would be significant and negative. Canadian air travelers would be faced with significant additional operational costs that would reduce their competitiveness in an already competitive market. Madam Speaker, as the Minister has said, Bill C-42 is not a long or complicated piece of legislation, but it is an important piece of legislation. It is vitally important for the Canadian public who wish to continue accessing southern destinations in the most efficient and cost-effective way possible. It is vitally important for our airline and tourism industries, which directly and indirectly provide over 1 million jobs to Canadian workers. Mr. Speaker, it is also vitally important to our safety and security interests, which require that we continue to work with all of our international partners to improve and enhance aviation security. I therefore will be voting to support passage of C-42 and against the sub-amendment recently put on the floor of the House, and I urge all honourable members to do likewise. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.